Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Carter Woodson Center and Deborah McDowell for organizing this incredibly important conversation. It's incredibly timely. I don't know if it was coordinated with Senator Webb, but it's kind of amazing that is happening at the same time. And it's such an exciting moment here in the Commonwealth. I was driving in from Dulles this morning and looking at those blue ridges, and I was thinking, darn, the state really is blue. I'm also very grateful to Ruth Gilmore for making room for me on this panel. I think my paper sort of has one leg in the historical panel this morning and one leg on these dynamics that have just been talked about here. And I'm also thinking the timing is going to work out because I'm noticing a lot of yawning going on. It's that biorhythm moment when lunch is now settling in past the digestion point and you wish you had brought some coffee in here. And that's not the point to listen to a really careful social scientist. Like Ruth. It's a good time to listen to a polemical clown. I will try to keep you a little more awake. And you'll be awake at 9 tomorrow when you get here for Ruth's book. So let me start by saying that I'm incredibly optimistic, even though I'm going to talk about some really kind of pessimistic stuff here. But I'm really optimistic, and I've now grown middle-aged looking at the phenomena of mass imprisonment. I wrote my dissertation in the mid-'80s in California on the prison and parole system. And I feel like we're at a moment that we've never been at in this whole 30, 40-year period, potential for change. Mass imprisonment, most importantly, as this very conference suggests, is now visible as a public problem of the first order. And I don't care what Obama can say, but you know what's going on inside his head. You know he thinks that it's unsustainable. These are his words. He just doesn't apply them to this. That it's excessive, that it's what you get when you, quote, govern through anger. He said the other day, we can't govern through anger. He was talking about AIG, but we ought to be applying it to these issues. In states like California, as Angela and Ruth know well, we're now facing a sort of super nova of prison crisis where this gargantuan prison system that has grown 7-fold since the 70s compared to about 4-fold for the rest of the country is now facing simultaneously an unprecedented budget crisis and this mega lawsuit that is just fascinating, and we could get into it. It would take me the whole time even to describe the moving parts of it, but it is a really epic lawsuit that could result in dramatic reductions in the California prison population. On the other hand, it might result in 30 new prisons in Mexico or something. It's not, it's very unclear. One of the things that encourages me is that the heavy racial disproportionality of our prison population has actually come to seem an increasing problem for the nation. It's an embarrassment in the eyes of the world that is now, thanks to George Bush, quite interested in our penal practices generally. Indeed, I would say that perhaps for the first time in our history, our penal system is clearly a good deal more racist than the society it purports to represent. And events like the grotesque murder of James Byrd some years back in Texas tell us a lot more about the racial climate in Texas prisons, where Byrd and his attackers had spent time, than they do about Jasper, Texas. Just as the outrageous over-prosecution of the Jena 6 is really a story about the prosecution complex in America as much as it is a story about traditional Southern race conflict. Now, even state legislatures seem to be getting it. You all know about the Rockefeller drug laws, a remarkable phenomenon when you think about that name once was associated with the liberal Republican of his generation that was singularly most connected to civil rights in his time, and now has his name forever tarnished with those drug laws. And even California voters last November rejected an anti-gang initiative that was written with all the bells and whistles that have usually attracted them, even in hard times. Now, much of the progress in recent years, I want to acknowledge, has come from a strategy aimed at de-legitimizing the incarceration of drug crime, particularly drug possession and use, but also to some extent minor drug dealing. This, what I call this drug-first approach, has a lot of appeal that I want to acknowledge. Harsh punishment for drug crime runs into powerful critiques that are gaining traction with many Americans. Prison for drug crime is distinctively associated with racial disparity, for one thing. The whole selection of which drugs are illegal, as historians have told us for a long time, has been deeply racialized from the very beginning. And drug enforcement policy and the harshest prison sentences have clearly seemed focused on the drugs most associated with minorities and especially African Americans. Furthermore, for many drug users, treatment seems a more humane and effective approach, while other drugs, particularly marijuana, could well be handled through the muscular civil regulatory approach we now have for smoking, for drinking, Can you imagine if California and Virginia were to compete for the best, legal bud in the nation? You guys could get rid of your tobacco industry. We could get rid of our debt. Finally, fear of drug crime is rarely direct. Mostly it's associated with violence generated by either the drug trade or the actions of drug-addicted users. When people consider drug crime in its own terms, they generally don't consider it an inherently serious crime. And all of this has been very fruitful for delegitimizing that aspect of mass incarceration. But I now want to turn to a far more pessimistic topic, having cheered you up a little bit, and that is our excessive fear and punishment of violent crime in America. And this is a topic that most people don't want to hear me talk about because it's incredibly difficult politically and emotionally to get into. But I have come to believe that this is what, to use a very awkward metaphor, I want to call the hardened back of mass imprisonment to contrast it with the soft underbelly of which the drug crimes represent. And my bad news bottom line is this. I do not believe we can extricate ourselves from mass imprisonment with a strategy exclusively based on moving drug offenders, even drug sellers, out of prison. And this argument was actually made forcefully a few years ago by Marie Gottschalk in her very fine book on mass imprisonment and the death penalty. I just want to read a quote. She says that while the drug and sentencing ballot initiatives vary greatly, they share some common features. They risk reinforcing a disturbing distinction between deserving and undeserving offenders. Many of these initiatives sanction throwing the book at drug dealers, recidivists, and violent offenders, thus reinforcing powerful stereotypes about crime and criminals that may help bolster the fundamental legitimacy of the carceral state. In short, we can't get there from here. At its best, in my view, the drug reduction strategy, that is the drug population reduction strategy, will produce an incarceration rate in America that is perhaps 25 to 45% lower than it is now, but still 2 or 3 times the norm for the 20th century. And just as importantly, this prison population will be just as concentrated with people of color. Indeed, I was just looking at the figures of people coming out of jail for minor offenses, including drugs, and the proportion entering prison for serious felonies, and it's about, they're comparable, basically, about, in the proportion of black and Latino inmates in those two groups. At worst, given our current practices of excess punishment for violent crime, a drug reduction strategy may actually anchor a sensibility that will lock us into mass imprisonment and distort the way America rebuilds its urban landscape over the next decades. Bottom line, we've lost our capacity to judge appropriate punishment, and the only way we can get it back is by confronting our fears about violence rather than avoiding them. So let me move over now and talk about homicide a little bit. There's a lot of different violent crime. One thing to remember when you hear talk about numbers of people in prison for violent crime is that most of them are not there for injuring anybody. I mean, violence is a very expansive category. And one of the things that's frightening is that having built up a kind of strong and apparently race-neutral commitment to reducing violence through punishment, we have actually authorized a lot of punishment of people of color who haven't injured anybody again. Now, a few things happen when we talk about homicide, however. First of all, I'm a deconstructionist, but look, it's not a socially constructed problem. Homicide is pretty real, as far as I can tell. It's had a long history in America. It has a significant overrepresentation in the black community and communities of color. It simply, there are features of it that are socially constructed, including that distribution. But as a problem, it's not a socially constructed problem. I don't think you can call it a moral panic when people get upset about homicide, right? The whole idea of a moral panic is that people get upset about something like graffiti, and they're bringing all kinds of moral judgments to bear on that. But when homicide is what's upsetting them, well, they have a reason to be upset. And there's, unlike drug crime, there's just no question but that the vast majority of people who commit a crime of murder or non-negligent manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, ought to be in prison for some time, right? The question is how long do they need to be in prison? Now, I teach criminal law, so I have to spend a moment saying that the law of murder might be seen as one of the truly great innovations in American jurisprudence. As you may know, at common law, there was only one category of murder, and it was punishable universally by death, although the English crown managed to pardon, more than half of the people in various, very class-specific ways. But it was America, beginning in Pennsylvania, but adopted by other states, that created degrees of murder, first and second degree. Even first-degree murder did not have a mandatory death penalty. The jury was almost always allowed to choose life rather than death. We created a far wider range of manslaughter crimes, and I could go into this in great depth. I won't. The bottom line is much of the world has looked at this development of homicide law as a serious and progressive effort to actually reduce punishment. And I actually believe that over time, the law of murder as it existed for much of the 19th and 20th century may have actually played a significant role in essentially regulating the overall level of punishment. I'm trying to get together some data to look at that more quantitatively now. The structure of modern homicide law was remarkably well suited to addressing the kind of emotions that are created by the real harm of homicide. The death penalty was available, and until the 1960s was readily used to address those killings that most alarm the public, which meant that for the vast majority of those convicted of murder, neither death nor even a very long time in prison was necessarily their fate. What we did, especially in the mid-20th century, was create parole boards so that it was a kind of perfect model. The family of the victim could sit there in the courtroom and hear the offender sentenced to life in prison, and then some years later, in an administrative process invisible to most people, the person would be let out of prison after a certain number of years. So it was actually quite a complicated and a well-adapted structure to sort of modulate the emotions that homicide creates. How well it worked, I'm going to try to get back to you on. But the bottom line is it really kept punishment levels fairly modest for homicide. This is staggering, but as John Irwin was confirming for me recently, that in California, as recently as the 1970s, a first-degree murderer would get out in under 15 years. And that was not atypical. And indeed, as I'll mention in a moment, that's much closer to what murder is treated as around the world today. Now, murder sentences have grown long across America. The mean sentence for murder, according to the most recent federal data, looking at 1990 to 2002 from major urban counties, the mean sentence was over 300 months. And so, that means there's a lot of sentences on the other side of that, 30, 35, 40, 45 years. A lot of people will estimate the current sentence of murder in California now is about 30 years, but that's only because it's calculated based on those that get released. If the majority who will never be released actually were to be calculated in that way, you'd have a much more gargantuan figures. Now, what I want to do is to try to briefly suggest three ways that this excess punishment is locking us into mass imprisonment. One is just the numbers themselves. I would argue that lifers, as we call them in California, and I'll explain that that's made up of a lot of different groups of people, have become an indigestible block of extreme punishment that has basically caught us in mass imprisonment, even if we were to dramatically reduce drug sentences and things of this nature. Now, going back to that complicated law of homicide, California actually has basically 4 different forms of life in prison. You have first, there are those people who are sentenced to death, which in California means you will be serving a life prison sentence, and maybe, if you live long enough, will kill you also. In other words, you spend as much time in prison as aggravated murderers would anywhere in the world, and then maybe will execute you. The truth is, you're much more likely to die of something else in California. So in effect, the death penalty has become a very obnoxious and ugly form of life imprisonment without parole. First-degree special circumstance murder, if the jury gives you life, you get life without parole, so you're basically in the same boat. First-degree murderers who don't have a special circumstance, which is what we call our aggravating factors in California to get you up from murder to the death penalty, you get you get 25 years to life. Third strikers in California, even though they almost invariably haven't committed murder, they do 25 years to life. And second-degree murders, that's the kind of murder that runs the gamut from road rage to spousal killing, basically insufficiently provoked to be manslaughter, but it's not aggravated by premeditation or a felony of some sort. That's 15 to life. Now, despite that great amount of differentiation, all of those people are going to die in prison, or the very vast majority of them. In effect, we have abolished all these distinctions, even though they remain there in the law. And there's a fascinating jurisprudence that the California Supreme Court has built up as they try to find the minimum amount of rationality that the state has to give to the apparent distinctions that it draws between those kinds of murder. Now, this is extreme compared to the past. I mentioned in California you could do 15 years for first-degree murder. Most of the rest of the world today, murderers serve fewer than 20 years. Finland, for instance, 10 years is typical. I was struck, not too long ago, the Israelis released a Lebanese militant who was probably the most infamous terrorist in Israeli custody. He had murdered a family in Tel Aviv. He'd been held for 32 years at the time he was exchanged for some body parts with Hezbollah. That's 32 years. That was the longest serving any Israeli prisoner had ever served. That would be, in California, you'd have to be, a battered spouse who finally killed their batterer and maybe then you'd get out for after 35 years, and it would be considered an extraordinary act of mercy, by the governor. So that gives you some perspective on it. This is an indigestible block. 30,000 lifers right now in California, about 1,000 new ones each year, about 5 released every year. And the reason for that is even though there's a parole board, they almost never find that the person's eligible for parole. And to make matters worse, in 1988, California voters passed an initiative closely tied to Willie Horton that made the governor personally responsible to approve every parole of a lifer, which means Gray Davis approved essentially nobody, Pete Wilson approved practically nobody. Schwarzenegger's been considerably more generous, which means he may have released 5 or 6 people a year. Now, point 2 about how this over-punishment of murder is holding us into a mass imprisonment situation. And this is borrowing from the work in behavioral economics and psychology. It's a well-known result in behavioral economics that consumers, in assessing the reasonableness of the price of an item, are influenced by the price of other items of which they're aware. This is a so-called reference point. If you've been out to a very nice dinner recently and you looked at the menu, you will notice that there's always one item at the top that's, maybe surf and turf for $45. And you're going like, no way, $45? I can't hope she doesn't order it. And if you were to go back into the kitchen and into the locker, what you'd find is that they hardly have any of those entrees. They're not there to sell. They're there to make you feel better about $33 for the steak, right? Otherwise, you'd be ordering the pasta for $16. So now apply that to punishment, right? If natural life sentences for even non-aggravated murders, if that's the price, right, then sending burglars to prison for decades doesn't seem like a terribly excessive thing. On the other hand, if the maximum sentence for a murder was 20 years, right, it would be very hard to justify holding a burglar in prison for, much more than 10, right? So you would ratchet down the entire structure of punishment if you were able to attack this top end. Finally, there's a category I want to call criminology, homicide, and net widening. Since the middle of the 19th century, murder has been a dominant crime in the public imagination. And while newspapers and novelists have a lot to do with this, criminologists also have a lot to do with this. We criminologists, I'll own up to it, have played a role in constructing murder as sort of the defining crime which anchors the entire continuum of delinquency, right? The basic insight, if you want to call it that, of scientific criminology is that the gravest offenses always begin with the tiniest delinquencies, right? That's why we have juvenile justice. That's why the system was based on trying to catch early-stage delinquency, sort of a medical model, right? Now, that suggests 2 things. One, it suggests that the small burglar, thief, or drug user may, in fact, be a murderer on their way up, right? So it holds in place a readiness to view as dangerous even the most minor offender. Likewise, it views the murderer, the actual murderer, as sort of the super criminal who would do all of the below crimes. In effect, you'd rape, you'd rob, you'd do all these things. Now, in fact, this criminological picture is not, no current criminologist, I think, would embrace it, because when you look at murder, it doesn't look like this at all. In fact, murderers tend to look a lot different than, not their skin color, but in terms of their background, life histories, etc. They are not your typical prisoner in many ways. But criminology has helped us believe that. Now, that anchors a dual action, right? Since murderers are the ultimate criminals who are capable of and likely to engage in crimes of all sorts, you basically should never let them out once you have them. Since minor offenders may seem relatively harmless now, but may be on their way up the continuum, you can't wait long before you decide to put them back into prison once you've got them on parole or probation. And we've seen this feedback, all too often. Now, let me move on here in the order of time. I think I've got maybe a couple minutes left to sum up. So let me say a little bit about this dark fear of homicide that hangs over our larger structure of overpunishment and mass imprisonment. As I said, homicide has been an American thing for a long time. There's been a lot of interesting historical work on the 19th century sort of discovery of homicide as a kind of secular rather than religious crime and the creation of that. Newspapers fed off of it, etc. I want to argue that something happened that changed the way homicide played out politically, and we associate it with the 60s, but like most of that decade's history, it actually happened in the 70s. Now, between 1964 and 1974, the homicide rate in America basically doubled. The interesting thing is that when Barry Goldwater gave his speech in 1964 saying that, crime is in the streets, it had barely budged above its, century low, right? So it was just beginning the climb. Robberies in the same period essentially tripled. Now, I do not want to, even though I believe these crimes are very powerful, very emotionally sensitive crimes, I do not want to offer you the sense that these crimes sort of created a reaction naturally and inevitably, which is the war on crime. In fact, I want to suggest, and I'm just beginning to work on this, that politicians and work by Veshla, by Catherine Beckett, and others have sort of focused on the role that politicians played in sort of priming the public's imagination on this. And the fact that a speech like Goldwater's really happens before the beginning of the rise tells you a lot. Personally, I think, and here because I'm not a historian, I get to just speculate, I think that the assassinations played an important role here. You know, in my family, these assassinations were, and I'm talking about, you know, JFK, MLK, RFK, these were understood as political events. Some faction of the government was taking out some other threat to leadership. That's how we viewed it in my family. But to the vast majority of Americans, these were street crimes in big American cities that indicated that even the most powerful people in America weren't protected, right? JFK is killed in essentially the reverse drive-by shooting in downtown Dallas. King is standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in downtown Memphis. Robert Kennedy's walking through the Ambassador Hotel in L.A. These are urban street crimes in a certain way in the eyes of the public, and I think they help put a white face in the case of the two Kennedys, and a sense of that even privilege can't protect people. The language of the politics of this era you'll still recall, and if you don't recall it, take a look at Rick Perlstein's book Nixonland, which brings a lot of it back up. In a lengthy position paper called Towards Freedom from Fear, which Nixon issued early in his '68 campaign, invoking Roosevelt's four freedoms to cast violent crime as the equivalent of the fascist threat invoked by FDR in '41, quote, "If the present rate of new crime continues, the number of rapes and robberies and assaults and thefts in the United States will double by the end of 1972. This is a prospect that America cannot accept. If we allow it to happen, the city jungle will cease to be a metaphor. It will become a barbaric reality." Right? So don't have to do a lot of work to unload the racializing of that particular statement, but notice that in the melange of the 60s, it's also Charles Manson, it's also Richard Speck. It's not simply a black face on Homicide, and I want to come back to this. In his convention acceptance speech, Nixon says, quote, "The first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence." And you can read that as kind of a renunciation of the civil rights movement, or you can look at it as an attempt to co-opt it and say, well, we're going to expand that vision to include, the forgotten, silent majority of America. LBJ, in a significant statement that I tried analyzing and I find fascinating, when he signed, finally, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, the law that I call the mother of all crime legislation that sort of began this repetitive, every other year federal crime bill that we've had almost every 2 years, every election year since, LBJ waited till the last possible day to sign it. His attorney general and others really didn't like it. It was full of all kinds of obnoxious, tough on crime, not very smart on crime moves. He finally decided to sign it, and he wrote in his signing statement a metaphor that has always fascinated me. He said that he hoped the law, as flawed as it would, quote, "lift the shadow of fear and the stain of crime from the streets of American cities." And sort of the image of murder is there. In his dissent to the Supreme Court's Furman versus Georgia opinion, Lewis Powell, the great Virginian, makes this point in explaining his dissent. "Brutish and revolting murders continue to occur with disquieting frequency." This is in 1972. "Indeed, murders are so commonplace in our society that only the most sensational receive significant and sustained publicity. It could hardly be suggested that any of these highly publicized murder cases, the several senseless assassinations, or the too numerous, shocking multiple murders that have stained this country's recent history," there's the stain again, "the public has exhibited any signs of revulsion at the thought of executing the convicted murderers. The public outcry, as we all know, has been quite the contrary." Now, as I said, I don't want to suggest to you that the war on crime was simply a response to violent crime. Clearly, political rhetoric preceded the fear and helped to define it before crime really began to rise. But I do want to argue that the fear of violent crime, and especially murder, forms the emotional core, the sense of grievance required for fueling the really massive reordering of governmental priorities that the war on crime represented. And only by reassessing that can we move beyond it.
You're at time.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.